Mark chapter 6. We'll just look at the first 6 verses. Mark chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "And he went out from thence and came into his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, From whence hath the man these things, and what wisdom is this which is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph, and of Judah and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they were offended at him. But Jesus said unto them, "A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and among his own kin, and in his own house. And he could there do no mighty work, save that he laid his hands on a few sick folk, and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went round about the villages teaching." We have come through some pretty amazing stories in the last few weeks in the book of Mark. We have Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee and going to the area of the Gergesenes and healing the demoniac and sending out the legion into the swine, and they go into the sea. We have Jesus raising the daughter of Jairus. We have Jesus healing the woman who simply touches the hem of his garment. And so we've seen these incredible stories, Jesus and his disciples on the water and him calming the storm with just a few short words. So we've seen these incredible stories and displays of Jesus' power over and over and over, and these wonderful, amazing victories and people being forgiven and just the work of God being done. And then we get to chapter 6, and it begins here with the statement that Jesus couldn't do anything. And it's just a dramatic shift from the stories that we have been seeing. And so for some reason, we're really not told why, Jesus decides here to leave Capernaum and to go to his hometown of Nazareth. Now, it could simply be that he just wanted to go give the people of his hometown one final opportunity. This is his second trip, actually, in his ministry. We'll look at the first one here in a little bit. But this is his second trip back home, again, to Nazareth. Now, as I've just stated, there's been a striking difference in how this particular trip plays out compared to what we have been seeing over the last few chapters of Mark. And so Jesus here, he comes home. And again, this is where he grew up. He comes home to a place where the people are familiar with him. They know him. They've seen him grow up from a child. And we might think that that would lead the people of Nazareth to love him all the more, to accept him even more. They've seen him. They understand he's different. I mean, there's no doubt that Jesus being raised was just significantly different than the other children in the town. However, what we actually see here in chapter 6, sadly, is the exact opposite. And so what we're going to see here in these few short verses here is a number of things that were missing or absent from this story than what we've been seeing here in the book of Mark. And the first thing, and I'm just going to go through this quickly because it just kind of was an oddity and kind of struck me. The first thing we see is the absence of crowds. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the absence of crowds. We've seen in Mark, everywhere that Jesus went, I mean, the crowds were just surrounding him. They were thronging him. In fact, just in the last story of Jesus with Jairus and the sick woman who was sick for 12 years, the text says he was being thronged with people on every side. In fact, as he gets back over the Sea of Galilee from going to the Gergesenes, he comes back and immediately is met with the crowd. It says he was nigh by the sea, and the crowd is already there. We've seen in the book of Mark how the crowds were pressing him to the point where he couldn't even sit down and eat bread. Everywhere that Jesus went, the crowds were following, and we understand that a lot of these people were simply desperate, and they have heard of the miracles, and they know this is the guy if you need a miracle done, and you go see him. And so the crowds were coming him, probably not for to hear the truth so much, but just to see a miracle or to have a miracle performed on them. We know that. We understand that. But nevertheless, everywhere that Jesus goes, there's a crowd, except when he goes home. When he goes home here, he's in Nazareth, there's seemingly no crowd. His disciples are there. His disciples are following. But we don't read of a crowd. We don't read of a group of people coming out and say, hey, we need to go see Jesus. 10 times in the book of Mark, we have read of the multitude of people surrounding Christ. 3 times we have read of a great many people gathered around Christ. Once we have read of much people thronging Christ. When Jesus, I just read this, just said this, when he came back from the Gadarenes, he was nigh unto the sea, and yet there's already a crowd there. The point being, in Galilee, the people in Capernaum, the people wanted to get to Jesus. In his hometown, seemingly the people didn't really care to have anything to do with Jesus. And so the first thing that really struck me was just the absence of what we've seen, the absence of the crowds. But secondly, and really the biggest thing, the most tremendous difference here is the absence of honor. The absence of honor. And so the most striking difference is the absence of honor that was bestowed on Christ. Now, I told you we would go back and we would read. So go over to Luke chapter 4, and we're going to read about the first time that Jesus came back to Nazareth. Now, you'll see that it's very similar as far as some of the events that transpired. But there are some differences, and we know from studying that this particular event here in Luke chapter 4, some people think that they're the same event, but the timing is not right. And so we understand that what we're going to read here in Luke chapter 4 took place very early on in his Galilean ministry, and our text in Mark chapter 6 takes place later, probably at least a year after this particular event in Luke chapter 4. But if you're there in Luke chapter 4, start reading in verse number 16. It says, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up for to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath appointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." And I love verse 20. He closed the book, and he gave it again to the minister, and he sat down. And the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened upon him, and just you can kind of see and sense the scene. Jesus, he just simply reads the text and sit down. And everybody's thinking, that's not what rabbis normally do. Aren't you going to expound upon this? If I just stood up here this morning and just read the text and just went and sat down, probably you'd be sitting there wondering, what in the world is he doing? This is exactly what Jesus does. He reads this text in Isaiah, and he sits down, and everybody's just kind of staring at him, thinking, well, he's got to say something, right? I mean, this isn't what rabbis do. He's got to say something. Look what he does. Verse 21, "And he began to say in them, This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." Well, they didn't like this. They didn't like this none too much. And it says, "And all bear witness and wondered at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, Is not this Joseph's son? And he said to them, Ye will surely say unto me this proverb, Physicians, heal thyself. Whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also thou in our country. And he said, Verily I say unto you, no prophet is except in his own country. But I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, when great famine was throughout all the land. But unto none of them was Elijah sent, save unto Sarepta, the city of Sidon, unto a woman that was a widow. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them were cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian. And all they in the synagogue, when they heard these words," look at this, "they were filled with wrath. And they rose up and thrust him out of the city, and led him unto the brow of the hill, whereon their city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. But he, passing through the midst of them, went his own way." So the first time Jesus goes back to Nazareth, the people literally tried to murder him. He goes in the synagogue, and he preaches, and he teaches, and they don't like what he has to say. And yeah, this is the hometown kid. In fact, some people say, we don't know this for a certain fact, but some people say that the city of Nazareth was very small, perhaps only about 500 people. We know it was a small city. It doesn't really pop up in any kind of important way. There's not even a church that was established there until much, much, much later. And so some people say Nazareth maybe only about 500 people. Listen, if you grow up, I grew up in a small town, but it was a lot bigger than 500. If you grow up in a town of 500 people, you know everybody. And everybody knows you. And so here's Jesus, again, the hometown kid, and he comes back. Does he get welcomed with open arms? No. In fact, they don't like what he says, and they try to kill him. And if he doesn't pass through the midst of them, which is a miracle in of its own self, they probably would have tried to do just that. And so here in Luke 4, he takes his first trip, again, early on in his Galilean ministry, probably about a year prior to the visit in our text, and they try to kill him. They're so mad, they're so angry at what he has to say. And then furthermore, in Mark, we've already seen back in chapter 3, that his own family thinks he's crazy, right? You remember the story back in Mark chapter 3. They sent his family and his friends come to check on him, and they try to take him back home because the text says in Mark 3 they think he's outside of himself. That's a way of saying, a colloquial way of saying, you're crazy. The things that you're doing, they're nuts. We don't like this. And so his family thinks he's crazy. Probably the only person in Nazareth who actually has any kind of support from him is probably Mary. Joseph, most people think by this point, has probably died. And so probably the only support he's getting is from his mother, who obviously knows and understands who he is. But his own brothers, his own sisters don't believe in him. In fact, they think he's outside of his mind. You're absolutely crazy. The last time he went home, the people tried to kill him. And so he's not getting a homecoming here. There's no banner saying, hey, welcome back Jesus, welcome back to Nazareth. No, he's coming into what should be a loving, caring town. He's walking into hostile territory. There's no crowds, there's no love, there's no grace, and there's certainly no honor. And so Jesus does what he did everywhere he went. Now this is interesting. Understanding what he'd been through, understanding the first time he come, they still recognize his position as rabbi because they still invite him into the synagogue. And so we've seen this. This is what Jesus did. He goes from city to city. He goes into synagogues. He preaches. He heals. He casts out demons. This is what he does. And so this is what he does here in Nazareth. And so verse number 2, and when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue. Now we're not told this time what he teaches or what text he used. We're not given that information. But it says, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, and they begin to ask a number of questions. From whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? And they go on. Is not this the carpenter's son, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judah and Simon, and aren't his sisters here with us? And they were offended. And so as was his custom, he goes to the synagogue. Now, again, as I said, they at least, they don't like him, but they at least recognize his position as rabbi. Now Nazareth as a city, Nazareth was only roughly about 20 miles from Capernaum. Capernaum has been the area where Jesus has done most of his ministry for a while now. And so they've heard the stories. They know, again, they know him personally, but they've heard the things that he's done in his ministry. They know of his popularity. They remember how fascinated they were the first time that he came. And so this was not them accepting his teaching so much as it was probably them just being curious about what he's going to say this time. Right? Hey, you remember when he came the first time? You remember what he said? You remember how mad he got? I wonder what he's going to say this time. And so this is not so much them accepting him as Messiah. It's certainly not that. This is them just more or less, I think, being curious to say, hey, what is little Jesus going to say this time? I mean, again, try to put yourself in the situation of a child that you watched grow up, somebody that you know. Maybe not know just real well, but in a town of 500, you know them. You've heard of them. Again, you watch them grow up. And so there's an intimacy there just by the knowledge of and where he grew up. And so when he was done teaching, again, and this happened everywhere Jesus went, the people were astonished. Again, I don't want to reiterate, we talked about this in great depth, but he taught with an authority the people had simply never heard. And so they're astonished, as they should be. But they begin to ask a number of questions here, and as I'm going to show you, these questions were not meant to uplift. These questions were not asked to clarify his positions on the text. These questions were asked for no other reason than to demean. And we'll see that as we go through this. So the first thing they ask, from whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? Again, he might not have done miracles there, but they've heard the stories. Again, they're only 20 miles from Capernaum. They know that he's done great things. They've heard. They understand the things that have been surrounding Jesus and the miracles that have been done. And so their first question is not about the truth that they just heard. Their first question is not, Jesus, tell us more about this. Jesus, give us more of this truth. Their first question is, how on earth does he know that? That's their first question. How on earth does little Jesus of Nazareth, this little boy that we've watched grow up, how does he know these things? He's not gone to some rabbinical school. He's the son of a carpenter. This is Joseph's boy. We know this kid. How does he know these things? In his first visit, he clearly states that he was the Messiah. I mean, they got that. They understood that. But they obviously didn't believe him. And so he can't possibly know this because he's God. You see, they're rejecting the truth flat out. The first time he comes, he reads them a messianic text, and what does he say? This day, this is happening in your ears. He's saying, I am who this text predicted. I'm the Messiah. That's what he's saying the first time he comes. So he's told them very clearly, I am the Messiah. Well, they clearly don't understand that, and they clearly don't believe it, or they wouldn't be asking, how does he know these things? They wouldn't be asking because they would know and they would understand this is the Son of God. This is the one we've been waiting for. But they can't believe that, because then that would be to accept that this little kid who maybe you didn't ever really like all that much, or maybe you disrespected in some way, or some way that, there's this hindrance there between them believing that he was the Messiah. And so they can't accept that as truth. And so they say, well, how does he know this stuff? It doesn't make sense in our mind. Interestingly, as I thought about this is the same kind of deflection that you see in politics all the time. You see it every single time a politician speaks. Essentially, they're saying this: I don't want to deal with what you just said, so instead of dealing with what you said, I'm going to attack you personally. Right? That's the same kind of deflection we see all the time in politics. I don't want to deal with the truth. I don't want to deal with what was actually spoken. I don't want to deal with policy. I don't want to deal with substance. So instead of dealing with that, I'm just going to attack you. And that's what they're doing here. Hey, we're not going to deal with the truth that he just taught us. We're going to attack him. How in the world do you know this? Next, they say, is not this the carpenter? Again, this is an amazing thing. Wow, a carpenter knows this. How does a carpenter know this? This isn't to uplift. This is to demean. Again, as I said, they know he didn't have any rabbinical training. Jesus didn't go to the school of Gamaliel like Saul of Tarsus did. Jesus didn't sit under these men. Jesus, at 12 years old, was schooling the rabbis, and they were astonished at his doctrine. And so how does he know this? This guy's supposed to be building plows. How in the world does he know all this about the Scriptures? He's just a common carpenter. Here, listen, I think you could boil all their thoughts down to this: there's nothing special about Jesus. And you know what? From a human perspective, they're right. From a human perspective, the text tells us he wasn't an extraordinary man. He was a typical man. If you were to put him in a lineup of people and you would say, hey, pick the Messiah, probably nobody would pick Jesus. It was his divinity that made him extraordinary. It was divinity that made him special. It was his divinity that made him stand out. But from a physical perspective, they're right. And so they're sitting there thinking, there's nothing special about him. How does he know these things? Jesus is nothing more than a simple, humble carpenter. He should leave the teaching to those with the proper training. Next thing they say, isn't this the son of Mary? Now we miss this in 21st century, but this is a tremendous insult. Is not this the son of Mary? Because they didn't say the son of Joseph. And so a lot of people say, well, the only reason they didn't say son of Joseph was because Joseph had passed away. That wouldn't matter. Even if his father had passed away, they still would have referred to him as the son of Joseph. And so this is an insult. This is meant, again, to demean. This is more than likely a slander against the way that they view what was at best a curious birth. The way that they would normally refer to him would be the son of Joseph. They did that. We read it in Luke 4. They asked, is this not Joseph's son? This is the way that they would normally refer to him. In John chapter 1, verse 45, it says, Philip findeth Nathanael and saith unto him, we have found him, of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. That's the proper way in which they would have referred to somebody, the son of their father. Now, some say that they said this because, as I said, they thought Jesus had passed away, but that's not true, because they would still refer to him as the son of Joseph, whether he was alive or not. Now, this wouldn't be the only time that people had slandered him for the birth. We read this in the book of John, in John chapter 8, verse 41. Jesus is speaking and says, you do the deeds of your father. And he's speaking about Satan there. And it says, then they said to him, we be not born of fornication. You see, this was something that Jesus had lived with. They understand that there's something odd, there's something different about his birth. And so this is something that they're throwing back in his face. Listen, Jesus, we weren't born of fornication. We know who our father is. And of course, Jesus turns around and says, yeah, your father's the devil. So in their view, not only is he a simple carpenter, but he's an illegitimate son. And then it says the brother James and Joseph, Judah, Simon are not his sisters here with us. You see, I think that what they're doing here is they're looking at the brothers and sisters of Jesus, which, just as a side note, tells us that Mary was not a perpetual virgin, as a lot of people try to say. He had brothers and sisters. But they look at his brothers and sisters and they say, nothing special about them. Why isn't he like them? We can see their lives, and they are doing and acting like we think Jesus ought to act. Why isn't he like them? You see, the people know his siblings as well as they know him. They are what they expect Jesus should be, which was, again, normal. Why aren't you like them? There's no reason in their minds that Jesus should be any different. All this led to them, as it says there in chapter 6, verse number 3, at the end of the verse, and they were offended at him. Probably a lot of the reason they were offended at him is because he's gone out from Nazareth. He's doing great things. He has these tremendous crowds. He's healing. He's teaching. He's garnered this tremendous following, and they're still in Nazareth. Perhaps their offense just comes at their jealousy or their thought that, why is somebody like Jesus? There's nothing special about Jesus. Why is he getting all this? Why is it not myself? Well, for whatever reason, they are offended. You see, they can't reconcile in their minds Jesus' teaching and works with the man that they watched grow up from as a boy. They can't put the two and two together. Yeah, we've heard about this Jesus and the teaching and the miracles and the raising from the dead, but it can't be Jesus. It can't be Jesus of Nazareth. We've seen him grow up. This is somebody we know. I'm not saying that they are disbelieving because he was acting out as a child or anything. We understand he was perfect. But it was that familiarity. How can it be this guy? It's from Nazareth. Nothing good happens to people in Nazareth. Maybe they're saying, I remember watching Jesus, wrestle around and playing with James and Jude, and you're going to tell me that guy is the Messiah. I can remember pimple-faced teenager Jesus. I watched him grow up. You're going to tell me that he's the Son of God? No. Which leads Jesus to this proverb, verse 4. A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and among his own kin, and in his own house. No one expects greatness to come from those that they are familiar with. Let me explain this. I was trying to think of the best way to explain this, and I just thought of this. If I was to go out today and poll every single citizen of Midlothian, and I was to say, who do you think will be the president in 30 years? Simple question. I would be shocked if one of those people said it's going to be somebody from Midlothian, because nobody expects greatness to come from familiarity. Right? That's what Jesus is saying. You don't believe me because you watched me grow up. If I was to tell all of you, for a lot of you, you've, for all practical purposes, watched my kids grow up. Micah was really young when we got here. April and Ellie weren't even born when we got here. You have watched my kids grow up. It would, not to say that you're demeaning my children, but it would probably be a great surprise to people in this room if 30 years from now Micah was a president. It would be a surprise to me. Let's just be honest. Why? Greatness doesn't come from home. When you think of greatness, you think, well, that comes from somewhere else. And so here's this little town of Nazareth, literally growing, watching the Son of God grow up right before their eyes. And they're so familiar with him, they can't accept that he is the Messiah. I can't have changed the Messiah's diaper. I understand they didn't have diapers, but you get what I'm saying. This is not him. It can't be. I'm too familiar with him. And all that leads to verse number 5, and this is just an amazing statement. And so we've seen the absence of crowds. We've seen the absence of honor, but here we see the absence of miracles. Now listen, Jesus was a miracle worker. Everywhere Jesus went, miracles happened. Right? We've seen a lot of them already in the book of Mark. He's raised the dead. He's calmed the storms. He's cast out the demons. He's healed the sick. Jesus does it. In fact, the text tells us that everywhere he went, he did these things. But then here in verse 5, and he could do there no mighty work. Now, we do see there that he saved a few, or that he healed a few that were sick. I guess we can assume that there were at least a couple there in Nazareth. We don't know how many, but at least a couple there in Nazareth who were willing to accept that he was who he said he was. But by and large, the miracles that had followed Jesus all over northern Israel stopped when he went home. And so we see this absence of miracles. Now, we need to recognize right away, and I think this is important that we note this, the problem is not with Jesus. This is not an ability issue. This was not the lack of power. That's not the problem here. The issue was the unbelief and the lack of faith in the people. And this brings us to the next point. And we've seen this over and over in the book of Mark. What was preceding all of the miracles, almost all of the miracles that we've seen in Mark? It was faith. Faith preceded the miracles. Jesus responded to the faith of the people. Just to take the last couple that we've looked at, Jairus and this woman. Jairus comes as the ruler of a synagogue, putting his position on the line and falling down before the feet of Jesus and saying, listen, I know you can heal my daughter. That's faith. The woman who has this issue of blood for 12 years, she says, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, he will heal me. I know it. That's faith. And Jesus responded to faith. Again, I said this last week. She was not the only one to touch Jesus that day, but she's the one that got the healing. Why? Because Jesus responded to the faith of the individual. And so here, there's no miracles performed. Why? It's not because he has a lack of power. It's not because his power had left him. It's because there's no faith in the people. Therefore, Jesus doesn't respond with miracles. This was the refusal to do miracles because there was no purpose. Signs and miracles in the New Testament were always given as a way to validate or attest to the truth. The people of Nazareth has already rejected the truth. Therefore, there are no signs or miracles to attest to what they have already rejected as true. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under the feet and turn again and rend you. In Acts chapter 19, Paul has been teaching in the synagogue at Ephesus for 3 months. He's been for 3 months teaching in the synagogue. And in Acts chapter 19, verse number 9, we read this, but when divers were hardened, their hearts were hardened, and believed not, but spake evil of that way before the multitude, he departed from them. You see, for 3 months, Paul has been in the synagogue, preaching and teaching to them the truth of the gospel and the truth of Jesus. And probably week after week, day after day, he's in the synagogue telling the people about Jesus. And when does he leave? When they reject that truth. So what does Paul do? Does he continue? No, he's not going to cast his pearls before the swine. If you don't want this Jesus, I'm going to go give it to somebody who does. And so he leaves. It's the same concept that's happening here with Nazareth. It's not a problem with Jesus. It's a problem with their faith. His first trip to Nazareth, Jesus gave them 2 illustrations that proved the same point. There were many, many widows in Israel, but Elijah had to go to a widow in Zarephath, which was a Gentile area, because he couldn't find faith in Israel. Though there were many lepers in Israel, only Naaman, a Gentile, was healed by Elisha because of the unbelief of the nation. Again, it was not the inability of Jesus to work, it was the lack of faith that kept him from working. And then lastly here, verse number 6. And what a sad, sad statement. And he marveled because of their unbelief. This is an incredible statement just by the fact that Jesus is marveling at anything. But the thing in which he's marveling is a lack of faith. There's only 2 times in the Bible does Jesus ever actually marvel. There's only 2 instances in the entire Gospels where Jesus shows this kind of reaction. Both of them involve faith, interestingly, but the first time that Jesus marvels was the faith of the centurion. In Matthew chapter 8 and Luke 7, Jesus turns around and says, I have not found faith like this in all of Israel. And he marveled at the faith of the centurion. And the other is here in Mark chapter 6, where again it's faith that's at the core of it. But this time it's a lack of faith. And Jesus marvels. When we think of the mighty things that Jesus did in the Gospels, again, I referenced many of them already. When we think of all these things, none of them are done in Nazareth. Jesus doesn't calm the storm. He doesn't raise the dead. Jesus doesn't feed the multitudes or walk on waters. What he does do is marvel at their unbelief. Some might think, well, maybe if Jesus had done some of those things, maybe if he had healed somebody, maybe if he had raised somebody from the dead, maybe if he had performed some of those miracles, maybe then they would have believed. Why didn't Jesus do that? Well, we read in Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You know the story, the rich man is rich, he's opulent, living in opulence. The poor man, Lazarus, is begging, and both men die. Lazarus goes to hell. Lazarus goes to heaven. The rich man goes to hell. And at the end of the parable in Luke chapter 16, the rich man is speaking, and he says, Then he said, I pray thee, therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him, speaking of Lazarus, send Lazarus to my father's house. He says, For I have 5 brethren, that he might testify to them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Then Abraham said unto him, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And here's what he says. He says, no. He says, but if one went from the dead, if you would send somebody from the dead, if they could see this, if there was a walking miracle in front of them, then they will believe. I know it. Just send Lazarus. This is what they need. And here's the response said to him. If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. What do you say? They don't need miracles to believe. Miracles, signs, they only attest to the truth that has been believed. He says if you want to know what they need, this is what they need. They have it. They have the Word of God. And so when we go out to people today, people say, well, if I could just see a miracle, then I would know God exists. No, you wouldn't, because you've already rejected the truth. You would find some kind of naturalistic explanation to explain away what was clearly a miracle right before your eyes. Because if you don't believe, then the miracle means nothing to you. And so if somebody comes with this argument, well, why didn't Jesus just do something? It wouldn't have mattered. They've already rejected him as Messiah. They don't believe in the truth. It's been right before their eyes for 30 years. And they don't believe it. They rejected it. And now, seemingly, opportunity is gone. Nazareth had everything they needed to have the faith they should have had. But they rejected the truth of Jesus Christ. In conclusion this morning, this trip, just to give you a couple of applications here, this trip actually turned out to be a lesson for his disciples in rejection, interestingly enough. We're going to see this next week, but starting in verse number 7, Jesus begins to send out his disciples. Well, we know from verse 1, his disciples were there. They followed him to Nazareth. They were there with him. They saw this rejection firsthand. And so this was a little bit of a lesson for his disciples to see how things might be once they start to be sent out. Furthermore, I've referenced this already, but Jesus knew their unbelief. Jesus had already experienced an attempted murder on his life the first time he went. And yet, in his love and compassion for the people, he goes back. Again, he gives them one more opportunity to hear the truth. He gives them one more opportunity to respond to the truth. And of course, they respond with unbelief. Now, the most amazing thing about this story, and this is, we talk about the power of faith. And we know that faith has, Jesus himself says, just the faith the size of a mustard seed, just have a little bit of faith. And it has tremendous power, mountain-moving power. And so we know that faith has an incredible amount of power. But look at the kind of power that unbelief has. Unbelief had the power to stop the miracles of Christ. Everywhere Jesus went, we talked about this, everywhere Jesus went, he healed, he cast out demons. But nothing is done here except for what we see in verse 5. A few sick folk were healed. Why? As we've said, Jesus responds to faith. Jesus responded to the faith of Jairus. Jesus responded to the faith of the woman. Jesus responded to the faith of the people that he has healed throughout the book of Mark. Faith has the power to move mountains. The lack of faith has the power to stop God from acting in your life. Have you found yourself stuck in a situation wondering why God hasn't acted? I ask this question. Do you have faith that he will? Have you prayed over and over and over again for some situation? Are you praying with faith that God will actually act? I mean, how many times do we sit there and pray for something, and in the back of our mind we're thinking, this is never going to happen? What is that if not a lack of faith? Maybe we've been praying for something for years, and we're getting frustrated and angry because, in our view, God hasn't come through. Maybe there's a lack of faith that is stopping him. Now, the last thing I want people to think is that if we just have faith, that we will get everything that we ever wanted. That's not what I'm saying at all. This, contrary to what many might want it to be, is not a text that teaches the only reason that we don't have health, wealth, and happiness is because we don't have faith. That's not what this text is. As we have seen, faith is the key that brings God to act in your life. But what we receive in faith will be what God desires for our life and not our every wish. Now, when our desires and God's desires are one and the same, yes, we will get the desires of our heart. But when we talked about this morning in Sunday school, when the desires of our heart are only evil and wicked, that's not what God's going to be, the blessings that God's going to be giving you. And so I don't want somebody to look at this and say, well, if only they had faith, then they would have had everything they ever wanted. They would, the prosperity teachers, they're going to have health, wealth, and happiness. All they needed was faith. And this is what they say all the time. This is their get-out-of-jail-free card. Well, you didn't get that blessing because you didn't have faith. Well, maybe they didn't get that blessing. They might not have had faith, but perhaps it wasn't the will of God for their life. Look at Stephen. Listen, it was the will of God not for Stephen to have health, wealth, and happiness. It was the will of God for Stephen to be stoned and to preach the gospel to the men stoning him. It was the will of God for Jesus to be nailed to a cross. It was the will of God for Paul to be beheaded before Nero. It was the will of God for most of the apostles to die gruesome deaths. It was the will of God for countless of martyrs throughout the years to die and to preach the gospel to their captors. Maybe it's the will of God for us to suffer. Maybe it's the will of God for us to go through some things, but that doesn't mean that necessarily that we're having a lack of faith. It just means that when we pray in faith for the things that God desires for our life, that's when we will get the desires of our heart. This is not a prosperity gospel text. They don't exist, by the way. Listen, I want Jesus to marvel at my faith. Not for my lack of faith, but for my tremendous faith in him and for what he did, for the kind of faith I mentioned earlier that we see in the centurion in Matthew 8 and in Luke chapter 7. We read this in Luke chapter 7, verse 9. When Jesus heard these things, speaking about the centurion, when he heard these things, he marveled at him. And he turned him about and said to the people that followed him, I say unto you, I have not found so great a faith, no, not in Israel. It ought to strike us, I believe, that the greatest faith that Jesus found in all of Israel did not come from an Israelite. The people who had everything. They've been God's chosen people. They've been the vessel by which God has blessed the world. They were the ones who were given the prophets. They were the ones who had the scriptures. They had the temple. They had the tabernacle. They had every advantage. And yet the great faith that Jesus found was not an Israelite. And yet it was the town of Nazareth, the town of Israelites, where he marvels at their unbelief. What kind of faith do you have? Do you have the kind of faith that brings the blessings of God? Or do you have the kind of faith that stops God from working in your life? Let's pray.